This podcast is all about the process called meiosis. But before we get into what meiosis actually is, we'll put this in context of why should you care about it? Why should you be interested in what meiosis is? There are some questions that deal directly with you that depend on meiosis. The first might be, why do you share some but not all characters of each of your parents? So you don't look identical to either of your parents, but you do have some features of your parents that are the same. Maybe you have the same eye color as your parents or the same hair color of your parents. One or the other, but not both, maybe both in some cases. What are the rules of this sharing game? How is it determined who's going to get which characters? And at one level, all the answers to this question lie in the process called meiosis. So that's where we're going to take a closer look at what meiosis is. So this you want to write down in your notebook. Meiosis is the heading for this podcast. And the definition of meiosis is a process for creating reproductive cells. So the cells that organisms use to have offspring are created in a process called meiosis. And this is not just human organisms, this is any organism that goes through what we call sexual reproduction. That is, two cells that come together to make one organism. When we studied mitosis, we studied what's called asexual reproduction, where one cell splits in half to make two identical organisms. Sexual reproduction is kind of the opposite. Again, two cells are going to come together to make one unique organism. So again, meiosis is how we create those two cells that eventually are going to go through sexual reproduction. Okay, let's start with humans because that's probably what you're most familiar with. And we're going to look at these cells that actually come together. So what we have in humans, as you very well know, the reproductive cells are an egg or a sperm. So egg and sperm are made through meiosis. Right? These are the reproductive cells we make in meiosis. Now what I want you to look at with this diagram is the number of chromosomes that are in each of these stages of reproduction. So in an egg we have 23 human chromosomes, and in sperm we have 23 human chromosomes. When those come together through fertilization, the 23 plus the 23 combine to form a zygote. So we actually have 46 chromosomes total. But they match each other. They're in pairs, and we'll talk about how that works later on. So the 46 total are arranged into pairs, these 23 pairs of chromosomes. The zygote, which is the result of the egg and the sperm coming together, goes through mitosis and divides and creates lots and lots and lots of cells, which eventually create an embryo, which still has 46 chromosomes in each cell in 23 pairs. So there are a lot of cells in this little embryo, but each little cell has 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs because it's gone through mitosis. So to get from a zygote to an embryo and then eventually a full-term baby, lots and lots of mitosis or copying of the cells has to happen. What we're interested in this podcast, though, is how do we get these cells with half the chromosomes in them? Okay, how do we get those egg and sperm cells with only 23 chromosomes in them? Again, the process of making those is called meiosis. Again, that's what we'll spend most of our time on today. Now, just to point out to you that this does not only happen in humans. This happens in all sorts of different animals, but sexual reproduction also happens in plants. Okay, this is not a diagram you're going to be tested on or anything, but I want to point out to you what's going on here in this plant structure. So we have at the top here, let me pull this out of the way for you. Okay, right here at the top we have a pollen grain. If I can get my pen to work. Okay, just doesn't want to write. There we go. Pollen grain right at the top. And the pollen grain is kind of like the male reproductive cell, kind of like sperm if you want to think about it in an animal. So the pollen grain is one of these reproductive cells. It gets attached to the top of a plant flower, which is called the stigma. It travels down through the structure in the plant, and I don't want to get too wordy with you here, but you can see down here in the bottom of this plant structure is an egg. Okay, so these pollen grains and eggs are reproductive cells of plants. They also go through sexual reproduction because the pollen grain has to get together with the egg to make what eventually becomes a seed. Okay, so that's sexual reproduction. Two cells coming together to form one unique cell. That cell divides into multiple cells that we call a seed. So, same idea. All right, a little bit of information about meiosis before we talk about how it actually happens. The process of making sperm or egg cells, in the case of humans, only occurs in your reproductive tissues. Okay, so for men or males, those reproductive tissues are the testes. And in females, those reproductive tissues are the ovaries. Okay, testes are where sperm is made, ovaries are where eggs are made. So meiosis is happening in males in the testes and in females in the ovaries. Next little piece of information. Those tissues, the ovary tissue or the testes tissue, has cells in it that are going to divide to create these sperm or pollen cells or the egg cells, depending on if you're a plant or an animal. And the special name that we give to these reproductive cells is gametes. Okay, so gametes can be any of these reproductive cells that are made, in our case, in our ovaries or testes. Next, these gametes that are made only have half the number of chromosomes. You think back to that first picture I showed you of making eggs and sperm. Remember, they only had 23 chromosomes in each of those cells. The final embryo had 46 chromosomes. So the gametes only have half the number of chromosomes as all of your normal body cells do. And then lastly, you'll see as we go through our diagrams of meiosis that meiosis is similar to mitosis. So we're going to be dividing up chromosomes, but there are some differences in how we divide them. So I don't want you to get confused between the two processes. So let's look at a little overview here of how meiosis works. So the first little circle at the top, and you are going to want to draw this diagram, by the way. I would do it step by step with me here. So this first little circle at the top, right here, represents the cell that's in the ovaries or the testes, okay? We call it the parent cell, but that just means the cell that we started with. Again, this is going to be in the ovaries, I'll abbreviate, or testes. Okay? Now those cells have, in the case of humans, 46 chromosomes, right? Because all of your cells in your body have 46 chromosomes. That's what makes you human. What happens then is that those 46 chromosomes came from your mom and your dad, right? So half of those chromosomes are from your mom and half of those chromosomes in your dad. In this cell, we're only showing 2 chromosomes, right? One yellow one and one blue one. And we're going to say that blue one that you have came from your mom, and the yellow one you have came from your dad. So you have one chromosome number 1 from your mom and one chromosome number 1 from your dad. And again, this is in your ovaries or your testes. What happens next, just like in mitosis, is that that set of chromosomes makes a copy, or the DNA replicates itself. Remember, chromosomes are made out of DNA, and in the S phase of interphase, we copy that DNA. So this original yellow one from Dad now has 2 parts, and the original blue one from Mom also now has 2 parts. We've got double the DNA, or the chromosomes have been copied. We still consider this 2 chromosomes, though. okay, because they're connected in the middle by a centromere. So we have one yellow chromosome from dad, one blue chromosome from mom. That counts as 2. Remember, we started with 2 up here as well. All right. The next step in meiosis is to take these 2 chromosomes, in this case, and divide them apart. You can kind of see that happening in the next diagram. We call this our first division, and this is when your pairs split. So dad's chromosome went this way, and mom's chromosome went this way. Right? But we still have 2 copies of the DNA in each cell, right? This one has 2 copies, and this one has 2 copies. So we haven't gotten down to half the number of chromosomes yet. Okay, we still have double the DNA. So we need to do one more division. And in this case now, instead of having 2 in each cell, we only have 1 chromosome in each cell. Here's 2 cells that have a chromosome from dad in them, and 2 cells that have a chromosome from mom in them. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 total gametes. Now, if this was a female doing this in her ovaries, so we started up here in the ovaries with 2 chromosomes in each one. Down here, these would each be an egg. So we'd have 4 eggs with 1 chromosome in each, ready for reproduction. If this was a male up here, so we'll just draw that in. Again, this would be happening in the testes, 2 chromosomes in each of the testes cells, and we'd end up down here with 1, 2, 3, 4 sperm cells, each with 1 chromosome in each. So again, it matters if you are starting with a male or a female. That determines whether you're going to end up with eggs or sperm. But in each case, you're going to get 4 of those gametes with half the DNA or half the chromosomes in them.